Welcome to another episode of the Watchdog here on Mint Press with me, Lowkey. Week in, week out, we are going against the grain and covering stories which are regularly marginalized outside the earshot of the masses. And this week, we have a very special guest. The leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, is someone who will go down in history as achieving a cleansing of the party, which is unprecedented. We are talking about thousands of people punished for being pro-Palestinian in genocidal times. We're talking about people cancelled outside the realms of acceptable political subjectivity. People that were told that they had no right to participate in this political process. Essentially, under his watch, the Labour Party was rendered a mechanism through which political participation was shrunk in this country. Now, we have recently heard the news that in Keir Starmer's own constituency, he is due to face significant challenge. Now, that challenge is not coming from somebody who has an unknown track record. It's coming from somebody whose track record spans across the planet, an expert in the arms trade, a member of parliament for the African National Congress under Nelson Mandela, somebody who has campaigned for decades on important issues that really cut to the core of power and the way it functions in society. Somebody who has studied the arms trade in forensic detail and has provided not only with the Shadow World book, an encyclopedic overview, and both on the macro and the micro level of this horrific and corrupt trade, but also somebody who is now stepping into the ring with the leader of the Labour Party and hoping to unseat him from this constituency, a constituency which Andrew himself lives in and has lived in for decades, in the forthcoming general election. So it's great to be joined today by Andrew Feinstein. How are you, Andrew?
I'm good, thank you. And thank you so much for having me on. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. Now, this news has been around as a rumor for quite a while, but now we have confirmation that you will be entering the forthcoming general election to compete against Keir Starmer and others. Just tell me a little bit about why you have taken this choice. You're not someone that has a history in this country of standing in elections. You're not really a politician as far as I see. Obviously, your history previously in South Africa was that of a politician. But in a way, you seem to have reluctantly taken on this job. Explain to us about that.
I suppose what has happened is, I served as an MP in South Africa, but in an extraordinarily unique time in our history. After our first democratic elections, it didn't feel like politics as usual. And it wasn't. I was involved in drafting some of the earliest public sector financial management legislation, obviously huge amounts of reconciliation work. It was a time of trying to bring a nation that had experienced a racist oligarchy for over 350 years, trying to bring that nation together, trying to establish a democratic state. Once that changed, and it changed after Mandela had stepped down from power when his successor, Thabo Mbeki, decided to spend $10 billion on weapons that we didn't need and that we've barely used, simply for the bribes. And I resigned on principle because Mbeki wouldn't allow my committee that I headed to fully investigate this arms deal. I don't believe in professional politicians. I don't think that our public representatives should be people who that's all they've done and it's all they do. I think politics should be about ordinary people being represented by other ordinary people from their communities. And I suppose living in Holborn and St. Pancras for the last 23 odd years, when I arrived there, we had a wonderful MP called Frank Dobson, who you would see around, would talk to people, would engage with people, didn't agree with everything he did politically, but a lot. Since Keir Starmer's arrived in the constituency, we've seen a sort of an authoritarian, undemocratic approach to politics, an elite approach to politics where, there's the sense that we're lucky to be represented by this person. And it's actually the other way around. Mandela used to say to us, don't think you're important. The people who elected you here and who pay your salaries, don't forget, are the people who are important. Our politics has got it the wrong way around. And so that has always bothered me. And the way in which people have been forced out of the Labour Party has obviously been an issue locally. It's been an issue nationally. And because of the way in which it was done, often weaponizing anti-Semitism to do it. As a lifelong anti-racist, as the son of a Holocaust survivor who lost dozens of her family, mainly in Auschwitz, as someone who's lectured at Auschwitz on genocide prevention, that really hasn't sat well with me. So people in the constituency sort of started talking to me a while back, asking me if I'd consider standing. And I focused first on sort of local issues. We have huge problems with council housing, lack of repairs, overcrowding. Unemployment is more of an issue than it should be in a central London seat. Inequality, obviously, a huge issue. Massive pressure on food banks, which in a constituency like ours, there shouldn't be. But this is a reflection of a Britain that has an historically high number of billionaires, but also record numbers of families having to use food banks just to feed their families, which is absurd, illogical. But then there are a number of things I think that, and I've been consulting with people over the last few weeks while there's been a bit of confusion as to whether I'm standing or not. And I've been saying to people, look, I'll be a part of a campaign, but let's see who the best possible candidate is in the constituency. And if we find the right candidate, I will work tirelessly for that person. And whenever I go to communities and suggest this, they tell me that I should stand, which doesn't mean I'm the best person in the constituency by any means. There are other extraordinary people who I've met who I tried to persuade to stand, some of whom felt they didn't yet have the political experience at this point. And in fact, there are going to be a number of youngish people shadowing me during this campaign so that they can learn the political ropes for the future. Because I want this to be a campaign that does politics in a fundamentally different way, in a way that is the antithesis of everything that Keir Starmer stands for. And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, his lack of focus on the issues that affect the poorest in our constituency. Secondly, he has defended, supported, enabled, and facilitated the genocide that has been going on in Gaza in an unqualified, uncritical way. He has refused to endorse a ceasefire. He made a mockery of Parliament a couple of weeks back when the SNP brought a very serious ceasefire motion to the Commons. And he basically strong-armed the Speaker into breaking with parliamentary protocol, maybe even violating the rules of Parliament, to effectively cast aside the SNP motion in place of a mealy-mouthed amendment from the Labour Party that would enable their MPs to say, we voted for a ceasefire, whereas in fact they did nothing of the sort. What they did is they gave the US and Israel effectively power to decide the basis of any sort of halt in hostilities, for how long, under what conditions. That's not an unqualified, immediate ceasefire. And then that behavior in Parliament was indicative of the way Starmer has behaved in the constituency, the way he's run the Labour Party, and the way I believe he will run the country. So I actually believe that he is a threat to the democracy of the United Kingdom. And those factors altogether, I suppose, have tipped me over the edge. And when I say we want to show that politics can be done differently, it's very easy to establish what my political views are. I do countless videos and have done for years. I write books. I've made films. I'm going to be in this campaign what I've always been. I'm going to be true to my views that I've held for a long, long time. I'm not going to change my views to suit certain people, or because the Labour Party, in all likelihood, will run a very dirty campaign. I'm not going to sink to that level. I'm going to be true to the principles that I've always held politically, and the principles that are fundamental to my identity. So it's not a campaign about me. It's a campaign about the broadest possible community in Holborn and St. Pancras. And I hope that it is also a campaign that is important locally, but also has national impact, because it is Keir Starmer who I'm standing against.
And if you were, you are somebody that knew Nelson Mandela very well. If you were to look at him as a leader and Keir Starmer as a leader, we both were politically and emotionally invested in the Corbyn project. We both did a lot, both locally and nationally, to try and bring that to fruition. And we saw all of those hopes and dreams of not only us, but millions of others in the country dashed. And Keir Starmer was a key part of that. If you were to look at his leadership qualities and stand them up next to Nelson Mandela, how would you weigh those up?
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that I was absurdly privileged as a white South African who had experienced nothing but privilege from the apartheid system because of the color of my skin, to have played any role, a minute role, in the struggle to liberate South Africa from apartheid and in the early years of our democracy. I cannot tell you how honored and privileged I feel to have done that. And I did nothing in my life to deserve that, to be honest with you. And so to have actually worked for Mandela as an MP under him, to have spent time with him in meetings and occasionally, very occasionally, one-on-one, I regard him as one of the greatest statesmen of the last century, certainly the post-World War II period. And what characterized him? Everything that Mandela did was based on the principle that he would treat every single human being he came into contact with as his equal, and with the respect with which he wanted to be treated. And that included his prison warders. He learned Afrikaans so that he could, which was the language of the oppressor, so that he could communicate in their own language with his prison warders. And they adored the man, even though they were imprisoning him. He had a humility, an integrity, an honesty. I'll never forget one of the first interviews he did after coming out of prison, quite a few years before he became president. He traveled to the US for a variety of purposes and was grilled on national television, on the big networks. And they said to him things like, how can you be friends with Gaddafi? How can you be friends with Cuba? And he just didn't flinch. He said, And he would say the same thing to everybody. It didn't matter who was asking the question. His views remained the same. He was incredibly consistent. He said, when I was jailed by the apartheid system, my comrades who had managed to flee came to the United States of America, and they told this country, the government, what it was we needed for our liberation. And we got nothing. So we went to Libya, we went to Cuba, we went to Sweden, we went to the Soviet Union, and we told them what we needed. And we got everything we asked for. And he said, you have to remember, the enemies of the United States are not our enemies. And then he was asked about his views on Israel, which he and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who I was also fortunate enough to know, described not just as an apartheid state, but an apartheid state worse than the South African state had been. Repeated his views. And he said, why would I befriend a state that I, someone who has experienced the worst of apartheid, recognize as an apartheid state? Why would I praise a country that was probably the most important ally of my oppressors, who helped my oppressors become a nuclear power? And I mean, I think the hosts, famous people like Ted Koppel were quite shocked at this honesty and that someone hadn't just bent their message because of the audience. So let me take that person who I knew and who I loved and who has been a huge inspiration for my life from a very young age, and compare him to Keir Starmer, who wants to be Prime Minister of Great Britain. Arrogance, changes his mind as soon as it suits his political purpose, driven almost entirely by personal ambition, has no vision, no political program that is discernible from anything he's ever said, became leader of the Labour Party on the basis of lies, 10 pledges that mimicked what Jeremy Corbyn had offered the country, which he immediately reneged on. And then in Corbyn himself, someone who he'd called a friend when he was in his shadow cabinet and who he'd been proud to serve under, in his own words, as soon as he was leader, he vilified him and has effectively, he's excluded him from the Labour whip in Parliament. He's done everything in his power to push him out of the party. So this is a person who adjusts their opinions, their views, their ideologies, their worldview on what will get him what he wants. And what he wants is to be Prime Minister of Great Britain. What he's always wanted is to be Prime Minister of Great Britain. But if we look at his record when he headed the Crown Prosecution Service, if we look at the way he's behaved in our constituency, drumming out anybody with progressive views from any of the branches, let's bear in mind that Keir Starmer has expelled more Jews from the Labour Party, supposedly to combat anti-Semitism, than in the entire history of the party before him. This would be like expelling Nelson Mandela from the ANC in order to combat racism. It's that insane. And he actually thinks people are going to believe this, that what he's doing is correct. Of course, there have been all sorts of non-Jewish people who've also been kicked out of the party on all sorts of spurious grounds. I'm not saying there's never been anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. I would argue there's probably been a lot less anti-Semitism in the Labour Party than there's ever been in the Tory party or in UKIP and those various other manifestations of the right wing. But this is the measure of the man. These instincts are undemocratic, anti-democratic and authoritarian. And I really fear that if this man becomes Prime Minister of Great Britain, we will find our civil rights, our rights to protest, the rights to open political speech and activity could be severely, severely curtailed, because all of his instincts when he headed the Crown Prosecution Service were in favor of the establishment, in favor of the elite, in favor of the ruling classes. And this really worries me about him. So, I'm not even sure that we should speak in the same conversation, in the same breath, as a leader of the quality of Nelson Mandela and of someone who is just nakedly, opportunistically ambitious, like Keir Starmer.
Andrew, what was it like growing up within the apartheid system? And was there a moment in which you had clarity that this was not the kind of system that you wanted to live in?
So in answering that, it's important to say that I was in many ways fortunate. One, because I was white. If I'd been black in the apartheid system, my experience in every aspect of my life would have been horrific. I had an incredibly comfortable life. I got a very good education. I loved sport, and I was able to play cricket and rugby to my heart's desire. But another way in which I was fortunate was my father, who was South African, was a sort of a white liberal. So he had problems with apartheid, but didn't fully understand the structural, systemic nature of it. My mother was Austrian and was a Holocaust survivor. She survived the Holocaust in Vienna itself, occupied by the Nazis, hidden in a coal cellar for 3.5 years. And when Gestapo or SS raids were happening in the area, which was a working-class suburb of Vienna called Floridsdorf, she would be rolled up into a carpet, and the carpet would be put up against the wall just in case they managed to shoot their way into the cellar. And when she came to South Africa, my parents met in London, and then my mom went back to South Africa with my dad. She understood what had happened in the Holocaust as a manifestation of extreme racism. And she saw in South Africa another variant of that extreme racism. And she believed that never again, that, many people spoke about after the Holocaust, and that we've created an entire international rule of law to try and ensure that another Holocaust never happens. She didn't think that never again applied just for Jews, but for all humanity. And she saw Black South Africans being treated like the Jews of Europe and the Jews of Austria and Vienna had been treated. So I remember at a very early age, she would sort of head out before breakfast, and I'd be a bit annoyed. And I'd sort of say to her, well, why aren't you having breakfast with us? And she'd say, no, I need to go and do some things. And then as I got older, she sort of explained to me that she belonged to an organization called the Black Sash of white women who would stand at busy traffic intersections, and they would hold banners protesting against some aspects of the apartheid system, which was a brave thing to do. But the reality was, as white women, they weren't going to be mistreated. They would maybe be arrested for a couple of hours. They'd never be put in jail for any length of time for what they were doing. But I'll tell you when it actually hit me, and I was probably about 12 at the time. And again, another area of fortune was that my dad could never settle down anywhere. My parents moved 29 times in the 32 years they were together. Wow. So I went to so many primary schools, I lost count. Wow. Because he could never really settle down anywhere. He once came home on a sort of a Thursday, I think it was, and said, oh, we're moving to Vienna on the Monday. And my mom said, you can't be serious. My mom had lived in one house in Vienna. And off we went. And we did that 3 or 4 times. My sister and I landed up calling it semigrating, because we always knew that my dad, after 2 or 3 months, wouldn't have learned a word of German and we'd head back.
Mm.
But that meant that we went to school in Austria. But we also saw a society that, didn't have this variant of structured systemic racism in it.
Mm.
It's not that Austria was racism free. There were issues around particularly Turkish workers who were in Austria at the time, who weren't treated well at all. But it wasn't sort of a legalized system of racism like South Africa was. I was able to, for instance, read the words of Nelson Mandela, which in South Africa you could go to jail for doing from a young age. And I remember being 12, and my dad's liberalism manifested in the following way. We once had some guys come in to paint our house, and they were so-called colored. And I'm sorry to use this racial nomenclature, but this is how they were defined under apartheid. So they were people of mixed race who were actually in the majority in the Cape Town area, but were treated as second-class citizens. Not as bad as black Africans, but far worse than white South Africans. And one of the painters told my dad that he and his sons had a jazz band. So my dad insisted that they came and played illegally, because it was after the time they weren't allowed to be in a white group area anymore. And we used to have these great nights at the house where they would play. Cape Town has an incredibly rich jazz tradition. That's probably best reflected in the music of people like Abdullah Ibrahim, Basil Coetzee. And I love that jazz tradition because I've known it from a very young age. These guys would come of a Friday night and we'd have huge parties at the house. They'd be playing their jazz. All of my parents' friends would be there. My mom was a puppeteer who worked in an illegal theater called the People's Space because it was non-racial. Abdullah Ibrahim, who was then known as Dollar Brand, used to come and practice there because he didn't have a piano at home. There was this extraordinarily famous playwright, Athol Fugard, who wrote these brilliant plays like The Island about the apartheid system with these brilliant black African actors, John Carney and Winston Chawner. I didn't realize, who these people were. These were just these really nice people my mom hung out with, and during school holidays, I'd go and spend the day there. And when I was about 12, I remember thinking one night when the painter and his sons had been playing at our house, and they started packing up to leave, and a police car came past the house. And literally two of them had instruments, and they were about to walk out the door, and they heard the siren. They came back inside and quickly closed the door. And my dad said, okay, don't worry, just go into this room. And if they come in, don't worry. And I thought, geez, what have these guys done? And I asked my dad afterwards, and I said, because once the police car had gone past, off they went. And I said to my dad, had they stolen something or what? And he said, no, it's just that they're not allowed to be in the suburb which is called Wynberg. They're not allowed to be in Wynberg after sunset. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, because they have to be in their own areas, the colored area. And he told me where they live. I said, gee, that doesn't make any sense. Because if they're working here, why don't they live nearby? And, in a very sort of naive way, that was the first time I realized that there was something fundamentally wrong with the system. And then I started going into townships a bit with my mom, and then much more intensively in my late teens, I ran a welfare agency at the University of Cape Town, and we had medical clinics in various townships and squatter camps. We conducted adult education classes. We used to build pit latrines in informal settlements, things like that. And it so quickly became apparent to me that Nelson Mandela was perceived by the vast majority of people in these areas as their leader, that the ANC and others, the PAC, ZAPO and other, these were the liberation movements. And that's when I came to put that sort of naive thinking about, whoa, there's something wrong with this, into a more sort of concrete political understanding of the fight for liberation against racism and against apartheid.
Now, Andrew, your particular position as someone that has that experience means that when you see Palestine subject to the project of Zionism, it will touch different parts of your psyche in many different ways. So it's a very unique position from which you view what happens in Palestine. What would you say are the commonality, shall we say, or the things in common that apartheid in South Africa has with Zionism in Palestine? And then what are the points of difference?
So the most important things in common, and I've thought about this a lot, I've written about this a lot, I've spoken about it a lot, because the Palestinian experience and the South African experience have a lot of similarities. Both systems, so the oppression of the Palestinians, the oppression of what were called non-white South Africans, the indigenous people of South Africa, is both based on racist white supremacy. That's the starting point.
I mean, sorry to interrupt, but I've always remembered that Theodore Herzl, at the beginning, he wrote to Cecil Rhodes incessantly to try and get his support for the project
absolutely.
in Palestine.
I mean, these, for the Jews, they describe themselves as a people without a land, and they described Palestine as a land without a people, which was unfortunately completely untrue. And that was exactly like the Dutch had done in 1652, when they first set foot at what was called the Cape of Good Hope. And they said, this is ours. This land is all ours. There are no indigenous people here. We don't see anybody. And I always wonder, both the Dutch and the British, who were all these people who then took up arms against them if there weren't indigenous people there, which is exactly the same as the Palestinian struggle. So even in my history lessons in a white state government school under apartheid, there were things I thought about, well, that's weird. They say that this land was unoccupied, but then they had to fight off all these people. Where did these people come from? And clearly they were people who'd been living on this land for thousands of years. The second thing about it, if you have a project that is based on a sense of racial supremacy, there is always an element of dehumanization that has to go in tandem with that. And this, for me, was one of the most disturbing elements of growing up in South Africa, is how white South Africans, sometimes even members of our extended family, would talk about black South Africans as though they were less than human, as though they were animals, as though their lives were somehow not equal to the life of a white person. And obviously not all white South Africans were like that. There were a whole lot of incredible people, many of them Jewish, some of them even Afrikaans speaking, of Dutch descent, who were absolutely adored leaders in our liberation struggle. I use the example of the fact that when Mandela was on trial for treason, a number of his co-defendants were Jewish. But so too was the prosecutor who sought the death penalty against them. And the majority of the Jewish community and the organized Jewish community were happy to benefit from the apartheid system. But the element of dehumanization is, I used to go to Israel with my parents from a young age. They would take me to Yad Vashem, the memorial to the Holocaust. But simply being around in Israel, and I'm not in any way saying that all Israelis are like this, but the majority are, just as was the case in white South Africa. The sort of language you hear, the dehumanization you hear, just at an ordinary level of society. Of course, at a political level, it's just sophisticated racist propaganda. And when I see what some Israeli ministers say about Palestinians, and then I look at some of their backgrounds of, this is a government in Israel that is proudly fascist, that is the most right-wing government in Israeli history. And I hear some of their statements, and I think, these are the same people who ruled apartheid South Africa. The irony of which is that the people who ruled apartheid South Africa when I was growing up were committed neo-Nazis. Some of them had actually been jailed during the Second World War because of their participation in Nazi-supporting militias, not just in German Southwest Africa next to us, but in South Africa itself. And that there are Israeli leaders who are reminding me of these South African apartheid leaders is what terrifies me. It really does. I also want to say, because it's important, there were members of my mother's family. She had a cousin who was about 15 at the time that they were liberated from the death camps, who thought she had lost her entire family. She made her way to Palestine. And there she discovered that her father too had survived and had made his way to Palestine. So I do, in the wake of the Holocaust, I do understand the desire amongst Jews for a place of safety. The tragedy is that by seeking that place of safety in Palestine, they decided to build their state on the lie that this was a land without people. Their state was built on the land of the Palestinian people who had been there for generations and generations and generations, who in many ways were Semitic people like them, and many of whom were killed, were forced off their land by the Zionist movement that led to the creation of the State of Israel. So you can't talk about the creation of the State of Israel and the understandable context of what created it without talking about the Nakba, the tragedy that occurred to the Palestinian people at the same time. And to do so is to commit crimes rooted in exactly the same racist white supremacy that led to the Holocaust, that created apartheid in South Africa. So it's a complex issue for me, but it's one on which I feel unequivocal, because I don't believe that racism, and especially the violent consequences of racism, are ever justified, no matter who the perpetrators. And this is the tragedy I feel about what is happening in Gaza today, is that the so-called Western world, our governments, the US, the UK, and Western Europe, are effectively allowing the state of Israel to commit genocide against the Palestinian people, as though the fact that a genocide was committed against all Jewish people somehow makes it okay for the state of Israel to be doing that. And that's very problematic at a whole range of levels, most important of which is that the state of Israel does not represent all Jews. And the actions of the state of Israel are not the responsibility of all Jews. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Jews around the world and in Israel who are appalled, repulsed, and disgusted by what the state of Israel has done for many years and is particularly doing in Gaza today. And to claim that every Jew supports Israel, that Israel represents every Jew, is actually both racist and anti-Semitic. And our politicians do it all the time. And, what is most tragic about that for me is that the lesson of the Holocaust is such a clear one. And that is that any form of racism, any form of discrimination, any form of oppression of a people by another people should be outlawed. And the international rule of law that was put in place to ensure there was never another Holocaust is now being completely ignored by our governments who claim to champion that, to justify what Israel is doing in Gaza, to defend the indefensible. And the reason Israel is doing that comes to the most important difference between apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel. And that is that under apartheid in South Africa, the South African state required the vast majority of people. Black South Africans constituted 83% of the population for most of the apartheid period, or thereabouts. And that was a source of incredibly cheap, effectively enslaved labor for the apartheid state, because whites weren't going to work in the mines. Whites weren't going to do the dirty work. And in Israel, they don't have that economic reliance on the Palestinian population. So you would never see the sorts of massacres, the sorts of genocide, to call it what it is, happening in Gaza, in apartheid South Africa.
I mean, to some extent, prior to October 7th, you had, 65,000 Palestinian construction workers, but now the society is being reshaped. There's the importing of people from Ecuador, from India, to try and fill that sort of gap within the construction industry. One of the early understandings that became dominant within the Zionist movement after the first, what they've referred to as the first Aliyah, was it was a failure because Palestinians were employed on the settlements to till the soil. And so that led to this understanding of the division of labor, whereby you had to establish separate not only institutions, but also separate sort of workforces for Jewish people and for Palestinians. And so what you now have is a way in which the Palestinians are being cancelled out of that position of importance, really, to the Israeli economy. I mean, but I wanted to ask you quickly, in the constituency that we're hoping you are elected as a member of parliament, there was the head office in this country of Elbit Systems. Now, what you have is, historically, Elbit Systems had an interesting role in helping to establish the electronic side of the military industry in South Africa. You also have this interesting way in which Elbit Systems has been able to build up a presence in this country. That's been pushed back by Palestine Action, really a movement that has developed in a situation where the political system seems intransigent to outside pressure on the issue of Palestine. Previously speaking, we don't know if that will change. We're seeing it reach such a fever pitch in terms of our political elite and the extent to which they have this sort of fealty, if that's the right word, to the Israel lobby, that it is reaching a breaking point. People are seeing now some form of repercussion politically for backing Israel to the hilt in this way, for this genocidal campaign on Gaza. Now, it's sort of one of the great ironies of this situation that you have Keir Starmer, who goes above and beyond to prove how pro-Israel he can be, being the MP for a constituency where Elbit Systems was driven out. Now, when you're in the position of someone that has these many decades of studying the arms trade, and you see a movement like Palestine Action develop, even among pro-Palestinian circles in this country, there is a shyness, there is a hesitance to endorse Palestine Action. But you have endorsed Palestine Action. Can you explain why?
I've done more than endorse Palestine Action. I have spoken on platforms with Palestine Action, on behalf of Palestine Action. I've provided expert evidence in court cases where activists have been arrested and charged with a variety of offences, most of them, by the way, found not guilty, and often in judgments that suggest that they've committed a lesser crime to prevent a far greater crime. So why would I do this? Well, for me, it's just completely natural for two reasons. One is, it's important to understand that I, in many ways, grew up in the ANC. And the Palestinian struggle was regarded as a fraternal struggle to our struggle in South Africa. So it has always, as long as I can remember, it's been a part of my political consciousness. And it's the fact of my family's history that has made it more so because, as I said, I think the lesson of the Holocaust is that we should treat every human being equally and with the sort of respect with which we want to be treated, which is what I learned from Nelson Mandela. And not because he said it, but because it's what he practiced. By the way, that made a nightmare of walking anywhere with him because he would stop and greet every single people. If he went to a restaurant, he wouldn't sit down until he'd appropriately greeted every single person working in that restaurant before he would sit down and have a meal. So we then add to that the fact that because of the corrupt deal in South Africa that I try to investigate as a very young backbench MP, that effectively undermined and corroded our incredibly young democracy in South Africa, I then went on an intellectual and an investigative journey, which was to reveal the reality that what happened in South Africa, where Tony Blair turned out,
was rule rather than exception, in a way. It was an aberration.
Entirely the rule. I thought we'd just been silly and ignorant and discovered that, in fact, what had happened to us, exactly what was happening everywhere in the world. When BAE Systems, with Tony Blair's help, paid £115 million of bribes on the South African arms deal, they were doing the same thing in about 6 or 7 other countries at the same time, paying over £1 billion of bribes.
Yeah.
So, this was endemic and systemic, and that's what I discovered. And then, as I started investigating this, of course, Israel plays an incredibly important and very unique role in the global arms trade. It uses the occupied Palestinian territories effectively as a testing ground for American, British, and European weapons, often weapons that are deemed illegal by international law, used very happily by Israel in the occupied territories. So these two sort of channels of my life, if you will, collided. And the frustration of working on the global arms trade and the frustration of being committed to the Palestinian struggle is that you see so little progress. In fact, you see things getting worse and worse. And, for many years, I would appear on the BBC and CNN and everything else like that. And I would try and argue that we should have a less corrupt arms trade and that our arms export control laws should actually be followed rather than just exist on paper to be ignored, to enable us to sell weapons to the Saudis to use in the killing of innocent civilians in Yemen over the past almost 9 years now, to be used by Israel in the slaughter in Gaza, which so clearly violates not only our own laws, but the International Arms Trade Treaty, of which we claim to champion, ironically. And I became frustrated with that, to be honest. But also I came from a political tradition that was very different to that. The struggle against a brutal oppressor isn't a polite struggle. You don't go and ask their permission to have rights. You don't go and ask their permission to not be killed. Because if you did, while you were asking for permission is the point at which you would be killed. And I saw in Palestine Action, and I had met one of the co-founders, Huda Mori, when she was an undergraduate at Manchester University. I showed the Shadow World film there. And her political journey had certain similarities with my own and with many others of us, in that she became frustrated by the polite way of doing politics, if you will, and activism. And when she explained the concepts of Palestine Action and the direct action that they took and the targeting of Elbit, It reminded me so much of aspects of the anti-apartheid struggle. We didn't go after every oil company or every bank. We went after Shell and we went after Barclays. Why? Because they were the most complicit, the most prominent, and they operated everywhere. And it was direct action against those companies, together with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, that had an enormous impact on the ultimate liberation of South Africa from apartheid. And what Palestine Action has done in a much shorter period of time, we've already seen 2 Elbit factories close down in the country. We've seen, as you said, their head office move away from Keir Starmer in my constituency. I believe this is the most effective way to struggle against the global arms trade, a trade that not only causes the sort of death, destruction, and immiseration that we're seeing in Gaza and have for many months now, but a trade that accounts for 40% of all corruption in all world trade, and that crucially, and it's really important that people understand this, that actually fundamentally and systemically corrupts our politics. So even in the countries where we sell the weapons from, like Britain, when we paid £6 billion of bribes to the Saudis in the Al Yamama arms deal, some of those bribes were paid to Mark Thatcher, the son of the then Prime Minister, who received £12 million, to the then head of BAE Systems, Richard Evans, who received an apartment in Mayfair that in the 80s was worth about £6.5 million. I shudder to think what it's worth today.
At the same time as he was on the board of the BBC.
Well, exactly,
Trust.
of course. So this really pervades the so-called establishment, the ruling class in the United Kingdom. And these bribes, this corruption, actually oils the wheels of our political system, so that people like Tony Blair, and let's not forget, Margaret Thatcher, when asked what her greatest political achievement was, says Tony Blair. Why? Because he'd turned the Labour Party into a neoliberal party and a pro-war party, and he'd realized that he wanted to make a lot of money personally. Gee, that reminds me of someone, a chap called Keir Starmer, who happens to be my constituency MP. The reality is, if Starmer landed up as Prime Minister and is so inept at politics, which I think he is, that he lasts no longer than Liz Truss. Don't know if you remember her. She was Prime Minister for, I think, 49 days, which cost us £74 billion, us, the taxpayer. Even if he only lasted for 49 days, he would be guaranteed, because of the decisions he took during those 49 days, of being a multi-millionaire for the rest of his life. And he would do exactly what Blair has done. He would go and work with the defense companies. He would go and work with the banks who finance all of this stuff, and they would pay him millions and millions to do it. And that is the systemic corruption at the heart of our politics. And rather than be polite about it and say to people, oh, if only we actually enforced our arms export control laws, or if only we actually took our anti-bribery and anti-corruption legislation seriously, we'd be a much better place. It's systemic. So how do you deal with structural and systemic problems? You have to destroy them. And that's what Palestine Action has set about doing in relation to Elbit Systems, which is an absolutely key part of the Israeli military-industrial complex, but also of the British military-industrial complex that is so important a part of our politics here. And so I suppose it's for all of those reasons that I feel incredibly comfortable endorsing the activities of a group like Palestine Action, because doing it the polite way has only seen things get worse and worse and worse, to the point where, as we sit here today, we're witnessing a genocide being committed in front of our eyes, on our screens in real time. And it is our weapons that are being used to commit that genocide, from which our ruling class is getting wealthier and wealthier. And if this is not the moment to say, well, polite politics aren't working, then I don't know what is.
Absolutely. One interesting aspect of the Tony Blair in South Africa story BAE Systems deal is that the Labour Party had over 50,000 shares in BAE Systems at the time when that was happening. This is insider trading, if ever
Well,
I knew it.
Companies like BAE Systems, I mean, they really are something completely unique. It's supposed to be a privately listed company, but it is so intertwined with our system of governance and government, so a central part of our establishment in this country, that it's treated as though it's above the law. And it's a bit like a piggy bank for our politicians and our ruling classes. It's remarkable. But I do have a bone to pick with you on this. And that is one of the first times we met about BAE Systems and all of this arms trade stuff that I've devoted the last 22 plus years to. You sent me a track of yours called Hand on Your Gun. And you asked me what I thought of it. And I felt when I listened to it, I felt a combination, because emotions don't always just go in one direction. I felt a combination of absolute elation and happiness and an extraordinary frustration. The elation and the happiness was, here is someone who was so talented and so smart that they were able to put into, how long is the track?
About 3 minutes.
Oh man, that makes me feel even worse. I thought it was 5 minutes. Okay. Managed to put into 3 minutes what it had taken me 555 pages and over 2,800 footnotes to write about in a book. And it has probably more impact than that
absolutely
book.
Not. Definitely not. Definitely not.
I really just want to reiterate the point that I'm regarded globally as something of an expert on the arms trade and the global arms trade. But it is people like the activists of Palestine Action, people like yourselves, and I don't know how to define you anymore. I used to call you sort of a hip-hop artist and a rapper, and people find it very funny when I tell them we're friends. They say, he's like a rapper. And I say, yeah, I mean, I have all these rappers who are friends. Believe me, you're the only one. But that it's people like you who, you all are so smart, so talented, and you're using this talent to fight these struggles that are so important to the future of the world. And I have to say, this is what gives me hope in the world today, because things feel so bleak. Our political class feels so completely disconnected from the people they are supposed to represent. They engage in things like what is happening in Gaza in our names, using our money, because it is our tax money that goes into companies like BAE Systems that enables them not just to make these weapons, but to profit from them. And those profits then go back into our political system and to their shareholders. But it's when I see people like you, the sort of people I'm now fortunate enough to work with, young people from all over the world, who have a sense that they're not going to do things like they've been done for generations and generations that have landed us in the mess that we're in. And it sort of reminds me of the situation I was once in South Africa when I was a lot younger. And I wish I could say when I had a lot more hair, but even then I'd lost my hair. I lost my hair when I was 19. I, at one point, had to leave South Africa rather suddenly to avoid serving in the apartheid military. And I remember the night before I was leaving, I went up to the hill that overlooks Cape Town, my home city, which I think, in a completely unbiased way, is the most beautiful city in the world. And I thought to myself, I will never again be able to set foot in the city and country of my birth. Because if in 1986, anybody had told me that apartheid was on its last legs, I would have used my first training, which was in clinical psychology, and offered them a straitjacket, because there was absolutely no prospect of it.
Wow.
And the reality is that, 4 years later, the most minor thing was that I could return home. But I could return home because the ANC had been unbound, because Mandela and the other political prisoners had been released. And a further 4 years after that, Mandela was our first democratically elected president. And that gives me a sense of hope and optimism. And then I see people like yourself, like Huda and many others, doing this incredible work that is bringing loads of other people into this work. And that makes me think this period of late neoliberal capitalism that has bequeathed the world such injustice, such inequality, has to be on its last legs. And I think that's what gets me out of bed every morning.
Wow, thank you so much, Andrew. It's been really lovely speaking to you. We appreciate you coming on the show. We hope that you come on again, and we hope that maybe the next time it will be as Member of Parliament for Holborn and St Pancras. Thank you to our viewers for watching us today. Please do support us in any way that you can. We need to keep pushing independent media. Over this period during this genocidal campaign in Gaza, we have seen actually the mainstream media have to retract claims, have to retract headlines, have to retract points, thanks to the work of independent journalists online. So we are in a fascinating time in terms of information and stuff like that. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.